Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Phoenix Cast. Today I have two guests joining me, and we're going to be talking about mental health awareness, the effects of coronavirus on mental health awareness. But before we go too much into today's topic, I'm going to let today's guests introduce themselves. Kristin, would you like to start?
Sure. My name is Kristin Kushmider, and I'm the Assistant Vice Chancellor of Health, Wellness, Advocacy and Support for CU Denver.
Hi everyone, my name is Katherine Miller. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I am the Advocacy Services Program Manager for the Phoenix Center at Auraria.
And then my name is Em. I am your host as always, and I'm the Violence Prevention Education Coordinator at the Phoenix Center. So I kind of want to just go ahead and jump into the topic today and talk a little bit about the article that you two kind of co-wrote together with Franklin Kim for CU Today. Would you like to talk a little bit about who Franklin Kim is?
Sure. Dr. Kim is the Director of the Student and Community Counseling Center for CU Denver. So definitely has expertise in this area along with Katherine and being able to speak specifically to some of the things that our students have been sharing as they've been seeking mental health support through this really challenging time.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So definitely a powerhouse of a team behind this article. Would you like to speak a little bit more before I kind of jump in with what I loved about it?
So, really, I think this article came out of a lot of thoughts and feelings that, we heard swirling around when CU Denver started going remote, and a lot of the messaging generally that was going around was, if we're positive, everything's going to be fine. And that leaves out such a significant portion of considering people's mental health and what people may need during this time, and the various responses that generally people were having to what was going on with, shelter in place and coronavirus and exposure to media and all of those kinds of things. And so Kristin actually felt really passionate about this and approached Frank and I and asked if we would like to help to co-write. And as someone with a background in disaster mental health, I was like, absolutely, because this is a disaster and this is what's happening right now.
Yeah, and I really, really appreciated that. I saw a lot of the same things, and I know that it's a lot of the conversations a lot of faculty and staff are having, and a lot of the conversations we're having with our students of like this need to be positive all the time, and it almost feels like this need, like toxic positivity. So that's something that I really, really appreciated about the article, because it really highlighted that we're all experiencing like a similar set of circumstances, but the way it's actually affecting us is wildly different. And maybe some people are in that like, yeah, this is bringing us all together mindset, but there's a lot of people who are also left out of that mindset. Can you tell me a little bit more about like the kinds of resources that you pulled from and some of your favorite points in the article?
I was very excited about the article as a whole. One of the things so we kind of each took parts that we felt really resonated with us. So I talked a lot about the disaster mental health stuff. I talked about grief and loss and, kind of helped to move into some of those coping skills. So that was what I was tasked with. And, we all wrote our individual parts and put it all together. And there was actually very little editing that happened in between our individual writing and like what, came out in that article. And, for those of us who have like done a lot of, I guess, like group projects, right? It's not uncommon that, you can tell when like different people wrote different parts and you're like, oh, the voice kind of changes here, the theme kind of changes here. And when I read each of our individual parts, I had trouble telling who wrote which part. If I wouldn't have known had I not been part of that writing process. And so I think that really showed to me like how collectively we were on the same page about what, we wanted that article to cover. And I thought it was just like a really like amazing cohesive experience, which has not always been my experience writing with a group, to be honest.
Yeah, I would echo that. And certainly when I started to think about where I could have a voice in this whole process and where I might have an opportunity to help change the narrative that was being communicated, because like you mentioned, and with the toxic positivity, even in our university communications, we were acknowledging that this was unprecedented, and we were encouraging students to stay positive, which I absolutely understand. We wanted our students to be able to successfully complete their semester as best they could, particularly those students that were so close to graduating. But what was missing from me was acknowledging that we were all in a trauma of some kind, and that not everyone, might be able to maintain being positive all day, every day. And so I also wanted to acknowledge that the various emotions that people were going to experience, even myself, of having good days and bad, or having days where I felt really hopeful, and having days where I just felt really sad, or not having an explanation on the days where I was feeling good as to why I was crying every time I saw, a first responder on the news. Or Dr. Kim had sent us a YouTube video of clips from around the world of various countries and individuals dealing with COVID, set to the 1980s song, We Are the World, and I couldn't finish it because I was just so moved and upset. And so writing is a format for me to be able to express that. And I knew that Katherine and Frank both had really strong expertise, and May was Mental Health Awareness Month, so I thought it was just prime time for this to come together. And as Katherine said, it came together so smoothly. And you had asked us what our favorite part was. And I would say that the opportunity to collaborate with our own staff and have that expertise shared with our community was definitely my favorite part. And the part that resonated for me the most was some of the content that Katherine had submitted that helped me understand why I was having those emotions as we cycle through this. So that was the part for me that this process was almost therapeutic in a way, to be able to express what I was feeling in a way that could potentially be helpful to others, and then also have others contribute content that was helpful to me.
Absolutely. And I really like what you said about like positivity. I really like that, because positivity is incredibly helpful, right? Like, so there are a lot of really great benefits to, taking a positive outlook. And when we're also going through, just like you said, an extreme trauma that the majority of the people alive today have never been through, positivity becomes toxic because it's not actually authentic to what we're experiencing. Like, sure, yes, there's that, and I'm sure we're going to talk about the graph soon. There's that moment of cohesion, but there's also all of the phases after that.
Yeah, and I think we often forget sometimes the harm in the message of like, just always be positive, because that negates the idea that anyone ever feels anything negative. And we assume that the feelings of negative emotions are bad, and they're not. Everyone experiences negative emotions, and our negative emotions tell us a lot, and we should be listening to those just as much as we're listening to, the feelings that we would name as positive, or the things that make us happy or feel joy, and those kinds of things. It's not uncommon, as Kristin described, especially during times of trauma, for folks to oscillate in between feeling, like, okay, like I feel strong and I feel motivated and I feel like I can get through this. And then in another moment, just be like, everything feels awful and I have no motivation to do anything and everything feels hard. And we have to create space for both of those realities to coexist, because both of those things are real.
And something else I think that is also important to acknowledge is, so if that's how we're all feeling here in this sort of room, have people who are working through this crisis, who can count on a paycheck and have some form of stability, how much many of the people of our community are feeling, many of the students in our community, many students who are raising families, working 2 jobs, and are full-time students. Something that we've seen is that coronavirus disproportionately affects communities of color, and in particular, the Black community, which has a much higher mortality rate around COVID than any other community.
I think going back to the point that you were making too about the positivity, and then I'll address just my comments on what you just asked us. But when we were preparing for this, one of you all, and I'm not sure who to give credit to, but had said this culture of this pushing positivity, that if you're not feeling positive, then you're doing something wrong. And so I wanted to say that to segue into how people are feeling, because in addition to dealing with the grief and the trauma, and as you said, pointing out that those of us who are in more secure or stable financial situations or are able to be distracted with our work throughout the day, you know, the impact that that has on others. And then you add to it that you're somehow doing something wrong because you're not able to stay positive when all of the news media campaigns are, you know, hashtag we're all in this together, or we're all experiencing this together. And then being able to have compassion and empathy for the groups that are experiencing this differently. And I also think that the impact of seeing how our system, in my opinion, isn't set up to support those groups, you know, that we don't have universal health care, that many of the frontline folks that are now considered essential are folks from, you know, lower socioeconomic communities, are people of color, are in jobs where they're putting themselves at risk every day, working at the grocery store or gas station or wherever folks are driving trucks, and what kind of health insurance they have access to should they get sick, or what kind of care they would receive should they be able to seek out care under these circumstances. I think just adds a whole additional, I don't want to say burden, but for lack of a better word, weight on the shoulders. You know, I feel, as a very sensitive person, I feel that. Even though I'm not in it with those communities, I still feel that empathy and compassion. And so, and also for folks like you all and our counseling center folks who are dealing with their own experiences with COVID, and then also having to subject themselves to hearing everyone else's experiences all day and trying to support those folks, it just feels like a lot. So I think anxiety, depression probably being key things that people are feeling and experiencing most days, every day to some degree, I would expect.
Absolutely. And I think it was you, Kristin, who mentioned something during our planning meeting about the idea of there's so many people right now who are considered essential, but when we think about them within the fabric of the United States, we don't actually consider their identities to be essential. We only view their labor to be essential, but we don't actually value it to the, you know, monetary amount that it deserves, nor do we actually value the life that's attached to that labor. And I agree. I think that's been highlighted more than ever.
Yeah. So even for the messaging of being able to say, like, now is a time to care for yourself, you need to practice self-care, is there's so much privilege in that. And that's something that often gets ignored. And so when we were writing that article, that was something that we considered as well, is that we didn't just want to give, you know, the typical messages around self-care, and often, you know, forms of self-care that have also been commodified by like capitalism and are really centered around whiteness. And so wanted to make sure that we weren't necessarily including those, but some helpful tips that could be useful for everybody. And that was a big part of it. And while writing the article, really just this entire time, considering so much of my own privilege and, you know, having a home that I could shelter in place in, having a room that I could make into an office where I wasn't going to be interrupted, knowing that I have really stable access to the internet, knowing that if I had, you know, some kind of financial strain, that I had savings to go back to, and I had family who could help me. And that's not generally always true for communities of color, and who are often like intergenerationally supporting one another. So I can't tell you how many, you know, students I had who reached out who were struggling because like they were working to support their families, and not just like, you know, their partner and their children or themselves, but also like their parents or their grandparents who maybe also lost their jobs, and taking more of those essential worker roles, even if that's not what they were doing in the first place, but a majority of them were. You know, there's also just a lot of comfort in even just being able to say, like, if we remain positive, then we'll be okay, and we're all in this together. It's like, yes, we all we have all been impacted by coronavirus, and it has dramatically changed the way that we all live our lives. But the ways in which those impacts have showed up is also drastically different. And so the messaging of like, we're all in this together can often come across as harmful. It's like, yes, we are, but like, here's the impact when we consider marginalized identities.
Katherine, can you also speak a little bit more about how this time and the ongoing sense of grief and the kind of roller coaster of emotions is also affecting survivors specifically?
Yeah. So, I mean, when we think of like grief and loss, what we often attach that to is death. And certainly we're experiencing that as well. I know, plenty of folks who have lost loved ones during this time. And that is certainly like exceptionally difficult. And we have layers of grief and loss as well. And so it's also important to acknowledge like other things that have been lost during this time. When I think about survivors and, having to shelter in place, campus was often a safe place for people to be. It was a space outside of the home that made them feel like maybe they had more control or autonomy over their day and over their lives. That drastically changed the minute that it went to shelter in place, right? And I'm sure that, plenty of folks have read articles suggesting that violence tends to increase during these times because of those shelter in place rules that force people to stay within their homes, right? Proximity to those who cause violence or who perpetuate violence increases violence. That seems pretty reasonable, right? So no longer could folks access services or just be in a space on campus, even if they weren't accessing services, just being on campus may have felt like something that they could control. And also heard, from a lot of folks that we work with, like even how hard it was just having to like meet with us through Zoom or over phone call didn't quite feel the same. As it felt, like coming to our office and being in our space. And it is a very welcoming space. It's like, here, do you want tea? Do you want coffee? Like our colors are very like warm and inviting. I have Star Wars stuff all over my office. Like it's just a space that you expect, which is starkly different than, remaining in your own space, or they can't even reach out because that's not an option. Right. So if there's nowhere to go except for home, and home is the place that is the most unsafe, it's very unlikely that someone is going to be able to have the space to be able to reach out and have a conversation with me in a way that also keeps them safe. And so that makes those things incredibly difficult. So I think there's, the grief around not being able to engage in the same daily routines that you had, regardless of what those routines are. We get pretty used to them. And it's really hard to break. Even, feelings of community are not as prevalent because, because we're all staying at home. So those feelings are different. We're grieving that. Educationally, I think we're grieving, students are grieving things like graduation and not being able to have that monumental experience, or grieving not being able to like be in the classroom with their peers or feel like they're not learning as well because they chose in person for a reason. And faculty are grieving like not being able to teach their curriculum in a way that they want to. Some things just don't translate as well online or even synchronously. And I had to adjust to teaching synchronously as well this semester. And it was not the same. It was nowhere near the same. It was exceptionally difficult. And, staff are also adjusting to like not having the same team environment that they had before, potentially having to put projects on hold that they were excited about. We had so many events planned, just for the PCA for the month of April, which is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And we had to adjust all of those plans, and we still did really cool things. And I'm very proud of the things that we did. So shout out to Em, but it wasn't what you planned, right? And so I think there was also a lot of grieving around that. And then like maybe on a more macro level, like grieving the loss of systems that we thought were going to support us. So maybe potentially, not getting the response from our representatives that we were hoping for, or not feeling as supported in that way. Seeing a lot of systems destabilize that we thought were there and were working really well. Healthcare, for example, like not having supplies that it needed. Education is not getting the funding that it needs to survive, essentially. And so seeing some of that destabilization as well. There's a lot of grief and loss in that. People are losing jobs in addition. And so there's, like a loss of identity. When people ask us, about ourselves, a lot of what we go to initially is, here's what I do for a living, or at least I do, because I'm very proud of those things. And if I wasn't able to say that, that's a huge, loss of my identity. And so I think grief and loss, it's like this really, really huge concept, which is why I talked about it for so long.
No, absolutely. And I think also, productivity is something that American culture is obsessed with, right? Like, because in addition to stay positive, the other message I know I saw a lot was start a bunch of LLCs and hustle and open 5 Etsy pages and like all of these to me, I was just like incredibly outrageous things to do in a time where like we have no idea what tomorrow looks like. At this point, we do have a little bit of a better idea of what tomorrow looks like because we're far enough in it, but we don't know what next month looks like, right? Like, and that's something that the article really talked about, is that like, what does normal look like and how can we put all these expectations on ourselves that we would normally put when we don't know what's next. We're still in this 6 phases. I think we're still in disillusionment. Would you say?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. And, on that graph, you can see that the disillusionment phase essentially lasts at least until the 1-year anniversary. So like theoretically, right, that's how long we would be in the stage, and you just kind of like bounce around in there. Mm-hmm. And I think that's absolutely what I'm seeing. People are like getting, excited that restaurants are opening and that they can go out and do more things. And then there's still, media out around like, here's how like cases are being reported, and here are spikes and things that are happening, and here are new hotspots that weren't hotspots before, and those things are still scary. I think even when we're planning on like what it looks like for us to return to campus, for example, that's not going to look normal or like normal in terms of like what it was before. It's going to be very different, and we don't know how long it's going to be different, and it could be different in that way for the foreseeable future. And so, there's often kind of a rush to go back to whatever normal was. I think there's a lot of disillusionment around like, that's not going to happen in that way, in the way that you anticipate, in the way that you expect. And, responses to disaster require significant change and adjustment and sacrifice and adaptability. And sometimes we don't respond very well to that. And part of that is what causes that disillusionment.
I think you both have mentioned things that also have been reminding me of some messaging that we're getting. And I think, Em, you had mentioned it with go start an LLC or go do this, right? So in addition to the expectation that we remain positive, there's also this expectation that we should be viewing this as an opportunity. And I think the word that I'm hearing often is to reinvent ourselves. And so I think we're seeing a lot of that reinvention play out now with the protests and legislative changes that are being proposed. But I also think that there's the expectation that we as individuals will somehow reinvent ourselves in some way. And that if you're not thinking about this as an opportunity, or you're not viewing it that way, or you're not at home eating healthy and exercising, it just doesn't give people the space to feel sad about all of the things that Katherine just so eloquently described that we've lost. Or this idea, Katherine, I thought it was great that you said the expectation that we're going to bounce right back to what was normal, and needing to acknowledge that it's not going to look that way anymore. And it may not for quite some time, or it may not ever, which I'm hopeful that it will. But I'm also just thinking of, the stresses on people whose comfort comes from maintaining some sense of control, given whatever their experience in life has been. Or people like myself, I love to plan for things. And so as I've gotten older, I've certainly become more open to allowing things to happen and being more flexible, and recognizing that everything is not going to go according to plan, and that's okay. But even thinking about for myself right now, I've been planning a vacation the end of this month for over a year. And just the feelings of guilt associated with still wanting to take that trip, the anxiety over whether or not it's financially appropriate to do so. I think the wanting to commit to doing something because I am in a position to stimulate the economy in some way, but then also not wanting to travel to bring anything else into new areas. So all of these things are going through my head over just this one thing of, you know, and for example, like the parks it's a national park where we're camping, and it's just, the parks just now opened, but it's limited. The lodging isn't opening till the end of the month, but you have to make a decision beforehand about whether or not you're going to continue your reservation. And I know we've talked about privilege, and I acknowledge that it's a privilege for me to even be talking right now about taking a trip, but I'm just thinking of all of the things swirling in my head about that one thing that feels so overwhelming that I can't imagine, you know, the various feelings and emotions that so many other people are having about their own individual experiences through this whole process. I'm not quite sure if I made an actual point in that tangent other than to seek comfort in feeling like, oh my gosh, I feel so overwhelmed by what should be like a simple decision, just thinking about the way that others must be feeling about decisions that are so much heavier than that.
So Kristin, I actually think that's like the perfect segue, because I wanted to hear, like, where are you both today? How are you feeling today? When you wrote this article, you were probably feeling one way, and when you woke up this morning, you were probably feeling different than how you even felt last night. So I want to definitely hear how you're both coping. So that's actually the perfect segue.
I would say that I think that my feelings have remained fairly the same throughout everything. And I think that that's largely attributed to the privileges that I have given what's going on. And, you know, like, I still oscillate between, like, some days I feel incredibly motivated and I feel excited about what I'm doing. And other days it's a lot harder to get out of bed or, like, do my hair or those kinds of things. 'Cause it's like, well, maybe no one's going to see me on camera today, so maybe I just don't do it. Which obviously, like, if I were still going into the office, I'm not vain about very many things except for my hair. So obviously I would be doing that every single day without question. So I think, you know, I have similar struggles now as I had when I was writing the article, and similar, you know, concerns. I think I tend to somehow, like, be like a very, like, brave person and proactive person while also being cautious. I'm not quite sure how I've come to that balance somehow, but I'm big on, like, how do I take a step back to try and see the bigger picture so that I can make a plan for what happens next, or try to have all the information before I plan what's going to happen next or respond to what's going to happen next. And even thinking about, like, the plan to return to campus, on some days I'm just like, you know, I'm brave, and, like, I know that I'm going to have anxiety about it, and it's going to make me really nervous. And I know that more than likely, like, once I do it, it's probably going to be fine and I'll be okay. But it's like that, the mental gymnastics of convincing myself of that can often be exhausting. And then other days I'm just like, it's too soon. Everything is too soon. How, like, no eating in restaurants, no nothing. Should I go back to disinfecting all of my groceries? And so sometimes I have those feelings in the same day, which is, you know, quite interesting. Yeah, still just trying to strike a balance and responding to it day by day. As you mentioned, that to me, it still is a day by day thing.
I would say the same for me as well. I think, again, whether it was part of us planning the article or part of us planning this conversation, I think it was you, Katherine, who talked about holding space for multiple things. And I think that language really resonated for me because I also feel the ups and downs of this. I can have one day where I sit down and I am a workhorse and I am productive and I get a lot of things done and I feel good, and then I've worked out and I eat well and I've done all those things. And then, just like you said, either in the same afternoon or the very next day could feel very differently, of dragging out my morning coffee and my pajama wearing pants until 11 as I sit on the couch and check emails and feeling distracted or having a hard time focusing because my thoughts are wandering to so many different places. The other thing that I found myself struggling with is knowing that I feel deep appreciation and gratitude for my own health, for the fact that my family is healthy, that my friends are healthy, that I do have resources right now. Again, going back to some of the things that Katherine mentioned, being employed, being able to have savings, being able to have family and support, and then also feeling a fear. So feeling gratitude and feeling hope that we will move forward from this, that we will be changed in a positive way down the line, so that when we look back at this 10 years from now, we can see that, even though we may not see or feel that now. And then also feeling hopeless or feeling, I don't know where to start to be active. My partner and I have conversations because we don't share the same political views on a number of things. And so having conversations around, when do you hit the threshold for where you've had enough and you take some kind of action? And so sometimes I think in order to stay on top of things and to better understand what our students are experiencing and how changes that are being made at policy levels and in government will impact us and will impact students, I feel the need to stay connected to those things. But I also struggle with all of the people saying, well, you should disconnect and turn off the media. And so just trying to again, hold space for all of those things or find balance, as Katherine so eloquently said, that is there room for all of that? Is there an opportunity to watch the news for a minimal amount of time, but to also know when I'm being impacted by it and to take a step away, which I won't lie, makes me feel guilty because I know I can do that. and so I think for me, it is definitely a struggle every day with just my own internal thoughts and emotions around it, but also trying to remind myself to continue to be grateful and hopeful for all of the things that I do know that I have, and to be hopeful that things will change so that others will quickly be able to get to that place as well.
Thank you both so much. I think that question is really, really important because I really do want students, staff, faculty, random people who have found us on podcasting apps to know that even for the people whose job it is to put on a brave face and support others, we're also experiencing this, and that's normal. And it is what it is. And we're support folks are together in that feeling of dealing with their own personal feelings of trauma and grief and loss, while also supporting people through their feelings of those same emotions and often a lot of other emotions. So thank you so much for joining me today to talk about this really, really important topic, for sharing so much of yourselves with us, for writing this article, and for seeing the need. I do think that this was very much a need, and that our students were not necessarily feeling seen in the way that they wanted to be seen. And I think that this article helped a lot. I know that I've gotten a lot of feedback from the folks that I've shared it with, that it's wonderful. It'll be linked in the episode description. So for folks who are listening to today's episode and are like, oh my gosh, I haven't read this article. Why haven't I? Don't worry, we've got you. The link is there. And then thank you again, Kristin and Katherine, for jumping onto today's episode. As always, the Phoenix Center remains open 24/7. Our helpline is available, 303-556-2255. Make sure that you like, share, and leave 5-star reviews of our podcast. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Join us next week as we begin our series discussing healthy relationships and tackle, are we in healthy relationships?